I watched a 7-foot creature carry a dead steer across my north pasture like it weighed nothing more than a house cat. Slung it over one shoulder, walked upright on 2 legs through the snow, and never once looked back. That was January of 1984, 4 months after I pulled a whimpering pup out of an abandoned well on my property. A pup that wasn't a dog, wasn't a wolf, wasn't anything that belongs in any book you've ever read. My name is Earl Whitfield. I'm 79 years old, and I've been ranching cattle in the Bitterroot Valley of western Montana since I was 23. 56 years on the same 1,200 acres my grandfather homesteaded in 1919. I know every creek bed, every ridgeline, every stand of timber on that land. I've pulled calves in blizzards, shot mountain lions off my fence posts, and once walked 9 miles through a whiteout to find 6 heifers that had drifted into a canyon during a November storm. I am not a man who frightens easily. I am not a man who makes things up. And I am telling you right now, with whatever time I have left on this earth, that what I found in that well in September of 1983 changed everything I thought I knew about the world I lived in. I've kept this secret for over 40 years. 40 years of lying to my wife, God rest her soul. 40 years of watching that tree line at dusk and knowing something was watching me back. 40 years of carrying a truth so heavy it bent my spine worse than the arthritis ever did. I'm telling it now because I was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 6 weeks ago, and the doctor at St. Patrick's in Missoula told me I've got maybe 4 months if the treatment works, and maybe 2 if it doesn't. So I figure the truth deserves to outlive me, even if I don't deserve the relief of telling it. It started on September 14th, 1983. I remember the date because it was my daughter Karen's 7th birthday, and Margaret, my wife, had driven her into Hamilton for a party at the roller rink. I'd stayed behind to check the fence line along the north boundary where it runs up against the Bitterroot National Forest. We'd been losing calves that summer. Not many. 3 over the course of June and July, which isn't unheard of with mountain lions and the occasional black bear coming down from the high country. But the way we were losing them bothered me. There were no carcasses, no blood trails, no drag marks. A 400-pound calf doesn't just vanish without leaving something behind, and these 3 had done exactly that. Disappeared from the pasture overnight like they'd been lifted straight off the ground. I told myself it was rustlers. Told Margaret the same thing. But rustlers leave tire tracks, gate damage, boot prints. I'd walked every inch of those pastures after each disappearance and found nothing except a set of tracks I couldn't identify. They looked almost like a barefoot human print, but longer. Maybe 14 inches from heel to toe. And the stride between them was enormous, 7 feet or more, which meant whatever made them was either very tall or moving very fast. I told myself it was a freak bear print distorted by mud. I didn't believe that, but I told myself anyway. That afternoon, with the house empty and the September sun hanging low and golden over the Bitterroots, I loaded my Winchester Model 70 into the truck and drove the fence line. I followed it north along the tree line for about 2 miles until I reached the old Hutchins homestead. There's nothing left of the Hutchins place now except a collapsed root cellar and the stone foundation of what used to be their house. They'd abandoned it in the 1940s, and the forest had been reclaiming it ever since. But there was also a hand-dug well about 30 yards from the foundation. It was deep, maybe 40 feet, lined with stacked fieldstone, and it had been dry for as long as anyone could remember. My grandfather had told me to stay away from it when I was a boy because the stone lining was unstable, and the whole thing could collapse without warning. I'd fenced it off years ago with some old cedar posts and barbed wire, more to keep the cattle from stumbling into it than anything else. I was checking that fence when I heard it, a sound coming from inside the well. At first I thought it was a coyote pup, that thin, high-pitched keening that young canines make when they're distressed. That sound that hits you right in the chest, whether you're an animal person or not. It was faint, echoing up from the stone walls of the well, and it had a quality to it that made me stop walking and just listen. There was something wrong with it, something I couldn't place. It was too structured, too varied. Like it was cycling through different pitches deliberately, almost like it was trying different sounds to see which one would carry farthest. I set the rifle against a fence post and walked to the edge of the well. The barbed wire was intact, which meant whatever was down there hadn't fallen through the fence. It had either been dropped in or had climbed in and couldn't climb out. I leaned over the edge and looked down. The well was deep enough that the bottom was in shadow, even with the afternoon sun almost directly overhead. I could see the pale gray of the dry stone walls going down, and at the very bottom, maybe 35 feet below me, something was moving. Something dark and small, pressed against the curved wall of the well. I went back to the truck for a flashlight. When I shone it down the well, my hands started shaking, and I am not a man whose hands shake. It was about the size of a medium dog, maybe 40 pounds, curled against the base of the well in a few inches of stagnant water. Its fur was dark brown, almost black, matted and wet. But it wasn't a dog. The proportions were wrong in a way that made my brain stutter. Its torso was too long relative to its limbs. Its forelimbs, and I say forelimbs because calling them front legs doesn't capture what I was seeing, its forelimbs were jointed wrong. They bent at angles that suggested elbows and wrists rather than the simple forward hinge of a canine leg. And its hands. God help me, it had hands. Small, dark, 5-fingered hands with short, curved claws where the fingernails should have been, and those hands were gripping the stones of the well wall like it had been trying to climb out and couldn't get purchase on the wet rock. When the flashlight beam hit it, it looked up at me. Its face was somewhere between a German shepherd and something horribly, impossibly human. A long muzzle, yes, with a black nose and visible canine teeth. But the eyes. The eyes were amber gold with round pupils, not the vertical slits of a canine, and they were set forward in the skull like a primate's eyes. Like a human's eyes. And when they locked onto mine, I saw recognition. Not the blank reactivity of an animal caught in a light. Recognition. Awareness that I was a living thing looking down at it. Assessment of what I might do. And underneath all of that, pain. It was hurt. Its left rear leg was twisted at a bad angle below what I can only call its knee, and every time it shifted its weight, that thin, keening sound came out of it, and I understood then that the sound hadn't been random at all. It had been calling for help. I stood at the edge of that well for probably 10 minutes. My rational mind was screaming at me to walk away, get in the truck, drive home, and never come back to this spot. Everything I knew about the natural world, everything 56 years of ranching had taught me, was telling me that what I was looking at was impossible. But there was another part of me, the part that had pulled half-frozen calves from snowdrifts and splinted the legs of injured horses and once sat up all night with a colicky foal because I couldn't stand to hear it suffering. That part of me looked at that creature at the bottom of the well and saw a baby in pain. I went back to the truck again. I got the heavy rope I kept behind the seat, a canvas tarp, and the leather gloves I used for handling barbed wire. I tied one end of the rope to the truck's trailer hitch and dropped the other end down the well. Then I did something that, looking back on it, was either the bravest or the stupidest thing I've ever done in my life. I lowered myself down. The well was narrow enough that I could brace my boots against the opposite wall and walk myself down with the rope. And that's what I did. 35 feet down into the dark with a flashlight clamped in my teeth and no idea what was waiting for me at the bottom. The smell hit me about halfway down. A thick, musky odor that was part wet dog and part something else, something sharper and wilder that I'd never encountered before. It coated the back of my throat and made my eyes water. The creature watched me descend. It didn't try to attack. It didn't bare its teeth or growl or make any aggressive movement. It just watched me with those amber eyes, tracking my progress down the wall. And when I was about 10 feet above it, it did something that stopped me cold. It held up one of its hands, palm facing me, fingers spread, like a child reaching for a parent, like it was asking me to come closer. I reached the bottom and the water came up to my ankles, cold and foul-smelling. The creature was pressed against the wall about 4 feet from me, and up close it was even more disturbing and more pitiable than it had looked from above. It was young. I don't know how I knew that with certainty, but I did. Something about the proportions of its head relative to its body, the softness of its features, the way its fur was still downy in patches along its belly. This was a juvenile, a pup, for lack of a better word. And its leg was badly broken, the bone visibly displaced beneath the skin of its lower leg. It must have fallen into the well, probably chasing something or exploring the way young animals do, and the impact had snapped the bone. I knelt down slowly. I was terrified. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my teeth, but the creature didn't move away from me. It made a soft sound, somewhere between a whimper and a chirp, and it held its hand out again. I pulled on the leather gloves and reached out. It grabbed my index finger with its hand and held on. Its grip was strong, much stronger than a human child's would have been, and its skin was hot, feverish almost, the way injured animals run hot. I could feel the individual fingers wrapping around mine, and each one had a small rough pad on the tip, like a raccoon's fingers. I wrapped it in the canvas tarp as gently as I could, keeping its broken leg stabilized against its body. It cried out once when I moved the leg, a sharp bark that echoed up the well and made my ears ring, but it didn't bite me. It could have. Even as a juvenile, its teeth were impressive, sharp and numerous, and its jaw muscles were already thick and powerful. But it let me wrap it up. It let me hold it against my chest. And when I started climbing the rope one-handed with this impossible creature cradled in my left arm, it pressed its face into my neck and went still. And I could feel its rapid heartbeat against my ribs, and something in me shifted, something fundamental and permanent that I have never been able to shift back. I got it to the surface and laid it on the grass beside the well. In the full daylight, I could see details I'd missed in the shadows below. Its ears were pointed and mobile, swiveling independently like a deer's ears. Its tail was thick and bushy, shorter than a wolf's, and it was tucked tight against its body in pain. The pads of its feet were thick and dark, and its toes, and yes, they were toes, not paw digits, were long and flexible with the same curved claws as its fingers. I'd guess it was about 3 feet long from nose to tail base and maybe 2.5 feet tall if it stood upright, which I suspected it could based on the structure of its pelvis and legs. I sat there in the grass next to it for a while, just looking at it, trying to make my brain accept what my eyes were seeing. This was not a dog. This was not a wolf. This was not a bear cub or a wolverine or any other animal that exists in the scientific record. This was something else. Something that walked on 2 legs and had hands and looked at you with eyes that understood. After about 20 minutes, I carried it to the truck and drove back to the house. I made a splint for its leg out of 2 pieces of cedar shingle and some veterinary wrap I kept in the barn, the same way I'd splint a calf's leg. It let me work on it without resistance, though it watched every movement of my hands with an intensity that was unnerving. When I finished, I put it in one of the empty horse stalls in the barn with a bowl of water and half a roasted chicken left over from the night before. It ate the chicken in about 30 seconds, bones and all. Then it drank the entire bowl of water and looked at me and made a sound I can only describe as a question, a rising tone like the upward inflection at the end of a sentence. I filled the water bowl again, gave it an old horse blanket, and closed the stall door. I barely slept that night. I lay in bed next to Margaret and stared at the ceiling and listened to the sounds outside the house. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something. Not from the barn, but from the tree line north of the property. A howl. But not a wolf howl and not a coyote howl. It started low and rose to a pitch that vibrated in my chest, a sound that was too deep and too complex and too long for any canine I'd ever heard. It lasted maybe 15 seconds, and when it stopped, the silence that followed was absolute. No crickets, no frogs from the creek, no owls. Every living thing within earshot had gone quiet, and they stayed quiet for a long time. I got up and went to the window. The moon was nearly full, and in its light I could see the north pasture stretching out to the dark wall of the forest. I couldn't see anything at the tree line, but I could feel something there, that primitive sensation at the base of the skull that tells you you're being observed by something that might be dangerous. The pup in the barn answered. A shorter, higher version of the same sound, muffled by the barn walls. And from the tree line the response came again. Lower, closer. I checked the rifle by the back door and went back to bed. I did not sleep. The next morning, September 15th, I walked out to the barn at first light to check on the pup. It was still in the stall, still wrapped in the horse blanket, and it lifted its head when I opened the door and made that questioning sound again. I gave it more water and the rest of a pot roast from the refrigerator. Then I walked out to the north pasture to check on the herd. I found them at the far south end of the pasture, as far from the tree line as they could physically get, clustered together in a tight group with the calves in the center. They were spooked bad, rolling their eyes and stamping, and 3 of my cows were limping. I walked the pasture north and found the first one about 200 yards from the tree line. A mature Hereford steer, probably 1,100 pounds. It was lying on its side in the grass, and it had been opened up from throat to pelvis in a single clean line. The organs had been removed, not scattered, not torn apart the way a bear or a mountain lion would do it. Removed, laid out on the grass beside the carcass in what I can only describe as a deliberate arrangement. Heart, lungs, liver, kidneys, intestines, all separated and placed in a rough line beside the body. The stomach contents had been piled separately away from the organs. There was remarkably little blood on the ground, which meant the animal had been killed elsewhere and moved, or killed so quickly and efficiently that the blood had been contained within the body cavity until the cut was made. I found 2 more steers in the same condition over the next 50 yards. 3 steers, each over 1,000 pounds, each opened with surgical precision, each with their organs removed and arranged. The economic loss was significant, nearly $3,000 in beef at 1983 prices. And I stood there looking at those carcasses, and I knew exactly what had done this, and I knew why. The message was clear, even if it wasn't delivered in any language I could speak. I had something that belonged to them. They were showing me what they were capable of, and they were waiting. I spent the rest of that day in a state of mind I'd never experienced before and hoped to never experience again. I was a practical man, a rational man, a man who solved problems with his hands and his head and the tools available to him. And I was standing in the middle of a situation that had no practical solution. I couldn't call the sheriff and tell him a pack of upright walking canine creatures had gutted my cattle as a message. I couldn't call Fish and Wildlife because what I had in my barn wasn't in any field guide they'd ever printed. I couldn't even tell Margaret because Margaret was a woman who trusted what she could see and touch and explain, and this was none of those things. I was alone with it, completely alone. I went to the barn that afternoon and sat outside the stall and looked at the pup. It was lying on its side with the splinted leg extended, and it looked back at me with those amber eyes, and I swear it knew exactly what had happened. It knew its kind had come for it. It knew what they'd done to my cattle, and it was watching me to see what I would do next. I sat there for a long time, Then I opened the stall door. The pup didn't move at first. It watched me step back, watched me leave the barn door open behind me, watched me walk out into the fading afternoon light. I went back inside the house and poured myself 3 fingers of Jim Beam and sat at the kitchen table and waited. From the kitchen window, I could see the barn door. About 30 minutes before full dark, the pup emerged. It was limping badly on the splinted leg, but it was moving. It crossed the open ground between the barn and the tree line in a path that kept maximum distance from the house. And when it reached the edge of the forest, it stopped. It turned and looked back at me. Even from 150 yards in the fading light, I could see those amber eyes. It held my gaze for maybe 5 seconds. Then it made a sound. Not the distress call from the well, not the answering howl from the night before. Something different, something softer. A series of low modulated tones that rose and fell like a sentence in a language I'd never heard. Then it turned and disappeared into the trees. I sat at the kitchen table and finished my bourbon and told myself that was the end of it. I was wrong about all of it. 3 days passed. No more cattle were taken. No more howls at night. The herd gradually moved back to their normal grazing pattern across the full pasture, though I noticed they still avoided the area near the tree line where the steers had been killed. I buried the carcasses with the tractor, and I tried to go back to my life. On the morning of September 18th, I found something on my back porch. A deer, a whole white-tailed doe, freshly killed, laid across the top step of the porch with its head oriented toward the door. Its neck had been broken cleanly, a single swift twist that had killed it instantly without damaging the meat. There were no claw marks on it, no bite wounds, just the broken neck and a single set of those impossible footprints in the soft dirt of the path leading from the tree line to my porch. 14 inches long, 7-foot stride. I stood there looking at that deer for a very long time. In my world, in the world of a Montana cattle rancher, when you do someone a kindness, you repay it. You help your neighbor mend a fence, he brings you a case of beer on Saturday. You pull a man's truck out of a ditch, he shows up in the spring to help you with branding. It's not transactional exactly, it's more like a language, a way of saying I see what you did and I acknowledge the debt. That deer on my porch was the same language. I saved their young. They took my cattle as a warning or maybe as the price of approaching their young. And now they were repaying the debt. I butchered the deer and put the meat in the freezer. The next morning there was a second deer on the porch, and the morning after that, a third. On the 4th morning there was no deer, but there was something else. A flat river stone about the size of my palm, smooth and dark gray, placed in the exact center of the top step where the deer's heads had been. There were scratch marks on its surface. Not random scratches. Lines. Deliberate lines carved into the stone with something sharp, forming a pattern that looked almost like a crude drawing. 2 vertical lines of different heights standing next to each other. One tall, one short. I picked up the stone and turned it over in my hands and felt a chill run through me that had nothing to do with the September morning air. The tall figure had 4 lines extending from its top, like fingers on a hand. The short figure had a line extending from what would be its leg, bent at an angle. A tall creature, a small creature with a broken leg, standing together. This wasn't an animal leaving a gift on my porch. This was an intelligence communicating through symbol, through art, through a representation of shared experience rendered in stone. I kept that stone. I still have it. It's in the top drawer of my nightstand right now. And I've held it on nights when the pain from the cancer gets bad enough that I need to remind myself that the impossible is real, that I didn't imagine any of it, that somewhere in those mountains something extraordinary exists. Over the following weeks, I began to see them. Not clearly at first. Shadows at the tree line at dusk. shapes that were too tall and too upright to be bears and moved with a fluidity that no human could match. I would be checking the fence line and feel that prickle at the back of my neck and turn to find a dark figure standing in the timber maybe 60 yards away, perfectly still, watching me with the patience of something that has no concept of hurry. I never felt directly threatened after that first night. The cattle were left alone. The herd grazed peacefully. Whatever message had been sent with those 3 gutted steers, the reply I'd given by releasing the pup had apparently been received and accepted, but they were there, constantly, watching. By October, I had identified at least 3 distinct individuals based on size and movement patterns. The largest was enormous, easily 7 feet tall at the shoulder when it stood fully upright, with dark brown fur that was almost black across the shoulders and back. I assumed this was the dominant male, the alpha, though I learned over the years that their social structure is far more complex than simple dominance hierarchy. The second was slightly smaller, maybe 6.5 feet, with a lighter brown coat and a distinctive way of holding its head slightly tilted, as if perpetually listening to something I couldn't hear. I came to think of this one as the mother, though I had no way to confirm that at the time. The third was the pup. I could tell it was the same one I'd pulled from the well because it still favored its left rear leg. Though the limp was improving week by week, it had grown noticeably even in the month since I'd found it, and it moved with a gangly adolescent energy that reminded me of a yearling colt still growing into its body. The pup was the one who came closest, while the adults maintained a consistent distance of 50 to 60 yards. The pup would sometimes approach to within 30, particularly if I was alone and moving slowly. It seemed curious about me in a way the adults either weren't or wouldn't permit themselves to be. I'd be repairing a stretch of fence and I'd look up and find it sitting at the edge of the timber, watching my hands work the wire and the pliers with those amber eyes that caught the light like a cat's eyes in the dark, but with an attention behind them that was nothing like a cat. Nothing like any animal. More than once I talked to it. Just quiet, steady talk the way you talk to a nervous horse. Telling it about the fence, about the weather, about Karen's school play. It would tilt its head at the sound of my voice, those pointed ears swiveling and adjusting, and sometimes it would make small sounds in response. Soft chirps and modulated tones that rose and fell in patterns too complex and too consistent to be random vocalizations. I started to believe it was trying to talk to me. I started to believe a lot of things that September and October that I wouldn't have believed possible in August. Margaret noticed the changes in me before I understood them myself. I was sleeping less. I was spending more time on the north end of the property, checking fence lines that didn't need checking. I was quieter at dinner, distracted, and when she asked me what was wrong, I lied and told her I was worried about the cattle losses. She accepted that because it was plausible and because Margaret was not a woman who pushed when she sensed a door was closed, but she watched me the way the creatures watched me, with a patient attention that missed nothing. And I think she knew long before I ever told her that something fundamental had changed in my life. I didn't tell her for 11 years. 11 years of carrying it alone, of walking 2 lives simultaneously, of being Earl Whitfield the cattle rancher by day and Earl Whitfield the keeper of an impossible secret by twilight and by dark. The weight of that dual existence settled into my bones like lead. By the winter of 1983, the creatures had established what I came to think of as a perimeter. They stayed within the forested boundary of my property, primarily along the north and east edges where the National Forest land began. They didn't approach the house, the barn, or the main working areas of the ranch. They didn't take any more cattle, and the pup's leg healed. By December, it was moving without any visible limp, and it had grown to about 4 feet tall when standing upright. Its fur had thickened for winter, and in the snow and the gray light of Montana winter it was nearly invisible among the trees. I continued leaving food out, not on the porch anymore, but at a spot about halfway between the barn and the tree line. A flat area near an old watering trough that I'd stopped using years ago. I'd leave whatever I had. Beef scraps from butchering, whole chickens from the feed store in town, venison from a deer I'd taken in November. The food was always gone by morning, and in its place I'd find things, more river stones with scratches. A perfect elk antler still attached to a piece of skull placed upright in the snow like a monument. Once a piece of obsidian the size of my fist, polished smooth on one side as if it had been rubbed and rubbed and rubbed against something for years. These weren't random forest debris, these were selections. Chosen objects, carried from somewhere and placed deliberately. Gifts, communications, I kept every single one. The spring of 1984 brought two things. The first was new calves, as it always did, and the work of calving season consumed me the way it consumed every rancher in the valley. Long hours, little sleep, the constant vigilance of watching for difficult births and sick calves and predators drawn by the smell of afterbirth. The creatures kept their distance during calving season, and I was grateful for it. The second thing spring brought was understanding. It was May, I think. Mid-May, because the snow was off the valley floor but still thick on the peaks, and the creek was running high with snowmelt. I was walking the fence line at dusk, which I did most evenings by then, when I came around a stand of Douglas fir and found the pup sitting in the middle of the trail. Just sitting, upright, hands resting on its knees, waiting for me. It was bigger now, close to 5 feet tall, and in the 6 months since I'd found it in the well it had changed. Its features had sharpened, its muzzle had lengthened, its shoulders had broadened, and there was a lean muscularity to it that hadn't been there before. But the eyes were the same, amber gold, forward-facing, and full of that unnerving intelligence. We were about 20 feet apart. I stopped walking. It didn't move. We looked at each other in the fading light, and then it did something I will carry with me to whatever comes after this life. It reached into the fur at its chest and pulled out a piece of cord. Braided cord woven from what looked like strips of bark and dried grass, surprisingly intricate, and hanging from the cord was a small, smooth stone. It held the stone out toward me, arm extended, the way it had extended its hand in the well. And it spoke, not words, not human speech, but a sequence of sounds so deliberately structured, so clearly intentional in their rhythm and intonation, that calling them anything other than language would be dishonest. 3 distinct sounds repeated twice with a pause between repetitions. Low tone, mid-tone, rising tone, low tone, mid-tone, rising tone. Then it set the cord and stone on the ground between us, stepped back, and waited. I walked forward. I picked up the cord. The stone was warm, body warm, and it had been carved, not scratched like the river stones on my porch. Carved, shaped into a rough but recognizable form. It was a hand, a 5-fingered hand, fingers slightly curved, about 1.5 inches long. A hand reaching out, the same gesture the pup had made in the well, the same gesture it had just made now. I looked at the carving, and then I looked at the creature, and something broke open in my chest. Not fear, not wonder, something bigger than both. I was being offered a gift by a being that shouldn't exist. A being that had remembered what I did for it months ago, that had crafted an object to represent that memory, and that was standing in front of me now, trying to bridge the gap between its world and mine with a piece of carved stone on a braided cord. I put the cord around my neck. The creature watched me do it, and when the stone rested against my chest, it made a sound. A single, sustained tone that vibrated in the air between us and resonated in my ribcage. Satisfaction, acknowledgement. I have worn that cord and stone under my shirt every day for 40 years. Margaret never asked about it. I think she decided not to. The years that followed don't compress easily into a story with a neat shape. Life doesn't work that way, and whatever this relationship was between me and the creatures on my land, it unfolded on the timeline of seasons and years, not chapters and episodes. But I'll tell you what I can. The pup grew. By 1986, it was fully adult, standing about 6 feet 2 inches on its hind legs, lean and powerful, with a dark brown coat that lightened to a tawny gold along its belly and inner arms. I called it that, in my head, the pup. Even when it stood taller than me and could have broken my spine with one hand, it was still the wet, shivering thing I'd carried out of the well, and I think it knew that's how I saw it, and I think in whatever way its mind worked, it was okay with that. Our communication deepened in ways I don't fully understand even now. The 3-tone vocalization I'd heard that evening in May became a kind of greeting. When I walked the fence line at dusk, I'd hear it from the timber, low, mid, rising. And I'd answer with a whistle I'd developed, 3 notes that roughly matched the tones. It always responded. Over time, our exchanges grew more complex. The pup would make sequences of sounds, long chains of modulated tones and clicks and something that sounded almost like a purr. And I'd listen and try to parse meaning from context. When it made a particular sharp staccato sound while looking toward the pasture, I learned it was talking about the cattle. When it made a drawn-out descending tone while looking toward the peaks, it seemed to be talking about weather or the mountains themselves. I am not claiming I learned their language. I didn't. I couldn't. Whatever cognitive architecture underlies their communication is so fundamentally different from human language that true translation may not be possible. But I learned to read intent, mood, warning, invitation, comfort. The way you learn to read a person you've lived next to for decades, even if you don't always understand the words. In 1987, something happened that changed the nature of our arrangement and nearly ended it. A man named Dale Prewitt moved onto the property adjacent to mine on the east side. Dale was from Billings, retired military, and he'd bought the old Sorensen place with the intention of running a hunting outfitter business. Trophy elk and mule deer primarily, with guided hunts into the national forest. Dale was a loud man and a hard man, and he had 4 plot hounds that he kept in a kennel behind his house, and that bayed and howled at all hours of the night. The creatures didn't like him. Within a week of Dale moving in, they'd pulled back from the east side of my property entirely, concentrating along the north boundary where the forest was thickest and Dale's land was farthest away. The pup stopped coming to the fence line on the east side. When I walked the north boundary at dusk, I could feel an agitation in their movements, a tension that hadn't been there before. They moved faster. They stayed deeper in the timber. The gifts at the watering trough became infrequent and then stopped. Then Dale's hounds went missing. All 4 of them in a single night, gone from a locked kennel with a chain-link fence and a concrete pad. No tracks, no blood, no damage to the kennel gate, which was still latched from the outside. Dale came to me about it, furious, convinced someone had stolen them. I told him I hadn't seen anything. I lied to his face, and I felt nothing about it. 2 days later, Dale found one of the hounds on his front step, alive and unharmed, but so terrified it wouldn't leave his house for a week, and when it finally did, it refused to go within 100 yards of the tree line and would shake uncontrollably if you tried to lead it toward the forest. The other 3 hounds were never found. Dale bought new dogs. Those dogs disappeared too. And then Dale started finding things on his property. Tracks. Scratch marks on his outbuildings, deep gouges in the wood at a height of about 7 feet. He found a dead elk on his access road, arranged the same way my steers had been arranged, opened up and laid out with surgical precision. He came to me again, shaking this time, and asked me if I'd ever seen anything strange on my property. I looked him in the eye and I said no. I said it might be a grizzly. I suggested he call fish and wildlife. I said everything a normal, reasonable, ignorant man would say, and I hated myself for every word. But I had made a choice the day I pulled that pup out of the well. I had chosen a side, and it wasn't Dale Prewitt's side. Dale lasted 18 months. By the spring of 1989, he'd sold the Sorensen place and moved back to Billings, telling everyone in Hamilton that the property was cursed and the wildlife in the Bitterroot was diseased. After he left, the creatures came back to the east boundary. The pup brought me a stone the day after Dale's moving truck pulled out. This one had new scratches on it. 2 tall figures and 1 short figure and a 4th figure, separate from the others with a line drawn through it. I understood. The threat was gone. They had driven it away systematically and patiently, and they were telling me it was done. I sat on the old watering trough and held that stone and laughed. I laughed until I cried, and the pup sat at the edge of the timber and watched me with its head tilted, and I think in its own way it was amused too. Those years, 1989 through about 1995, were the closest thing to peace I found in this whole impossible arrangement. The creatures were established on my land. I was established in their trust, and we had worked out a rhythm. I didn't go into their territory after dark. They didn't approach the house or the working areas of the ranch. The pup, now a full adult, met me on the fence line most evenings, and our exchanges had developed a comfortable, almost domestic quality. Sometimes it brought me things from the forest, a perfect quartz crystal, an eagle feather. Once a rusted tin cup that must have been 100 years old, probably from some long-forgotten trapper's camp in the high country. I brought it things too. Apples, honey which it loved with a passion that was almost comical, plunging its entire hand into the jar and licking its fingers with an expression of pure bliss. Occasionally a piece of beef jerky which it would smell carefully, turn over in its hands and eat with a methodical, almost analytical attention, as if it was studying the preparation process through taste. In 1994, I told Margaret, I had to. The secret was destroying me from the inside, manifesting as insomnia, as irritability, as a distance between us that she felt keenly, even if she didn't know its cause. I told her on a Sunday evening in November, sitting at the kitchen table with a pot of coffee between us, and I told her everything. The well, the pup, the cattle, the gifts, the stones, the cord around my neck that I'd worn for 11 years. She didn't speak for a long time after I finished. Then she asked me one question. She said, "Earl, are they dangerous?" And I said, "They can be. To people who threaten them, yes. But not to us. Not to me." She was quiet again for a while, and then she said, "Show me." I took her to the fence line at dusk the next evening. It was one of the hardest walks of my life because if the pup didn't show, I was a crazy old rancher with a story no sane person would believe. And if it did show, Margaret's world would break the way mine had broken 11 years earlier. The pup came. It emerged from the timber at about 40 yards, stood upright in the last light of the November sun, and looked at us. Margaret grabbed my arm so hard she left bruises. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She stood there and looked at this 6'2" creature with its dark fur and its amber eyes and its impossible hands. And after about 30 seconds, she said very quietly, "How long has it been coming here?" I said, "Since 1983. She said, "Does it know I'm your wife?" I said, "I don't know." Then the pup did something it had never done before. It walked forward, not to its usual 30-yard comfort zone, but closer. 20 yards, 15. It stopped about 12 yards from us and sat down in the grass and looked at Margaret with a directness that made me hold my breath. Then it reached into its chest fur and pulled out a stone on a cord. A second one. It set it on the ground and pushed it toward us with one hand, then backed away. I walked forward and picked it up. It was a carving like mine. But this one was two figures side by side, two hands reaching. I gave it to Margaret. She held it and looked at the creature, and then she looked at me and there were tears running down her face. She said, "It made this for me." I said, "Yes, I believe it did. She wore that cord until the day she died. That was in 2011, breast cancer. She was 68. Margaret's death almost broke me. It did break something, some fundamental structural element in the architecture of my ability to keep going. I was 65 years old, alone on 1,200 acres, and the woman who had shared the last 17 years of my secret was gone. Karen was in Portland by then, married with 2 kids of her own, and she called every Sunday and visited at Thanksgiving and worried about me the way children worry about aging parents, but she didn't know. She still doesn't know. I haven't decided yet if I'll tell her before I go. In the weeks after Margaret's funeral, the pup came closer than it ever had. I was sitting on the back porch one evening, November again, cold enough that my breath was visible. And I wasn't walking the fence line because I didn't have the energy for it. And I heard the 3-tone greeting from the tree line. I answered with my whistle, but I didn't get up. A few minutes later, I heard movement in the grass, and when I looked up, the pup was standing at the edge of the porch, 10 feet from me. Closer than it had ever been since the day I'd carried it out of the well. It was 28 years old by then, if its aging was anything like a human's. Or maybe it was equivalent to middle-aged in its own kind's lifespan. Its muzzle had started to show gray around the edges, and there were old scars on its arms and torso from conflicts I knew nothing about. It stood there and looked at me, and then it made a sound I'd never heard from it before. A long, low, sustained tone that wavered and broke and reformed. The closest human equivalent I can give you is a lament. A mourning song. It had seen Margaret on the fence line dozens of times over the years. It had made her the cord and stone. And now it was standing on my porch, singing grief in a voice that wasn't human, but carried a weight of feeling that was unmistakable. I put my face in my hands and cried. I cried for Margaret and for myself and for this creature that had known us both and was the only living thing on earth that understood exactly what I had lost. The pup sat down on the porch beside me, not touching me, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from its body. It stayed there until I stopped crying, and then it stayed a while longer. And then it rose and walked back into the dark, and I went inside and poured myself a drink and sat in the kitchen where Margaret's chair was empty and felt, for the first time in months, slightly less alone. The years after Margaret passed were quiet ones. Karen stopped visiting as often because her kids were in school and the trip from Portland was long, and I didn't blame her for that. I ran the ranch on a smaller scale, selling off half the herd and leasing out the south pastures to a younger rancher named Jim Coulter, who didn't ask too many questions about why I kept the north pastures off limits. The creatures were still there. The pup, the big male, the female I'd always thought of as the mother, and by then 2 others I'd started seeing in the timber. Younger ones, maybe offspring of the pup itself, though I couldn't be sure. Their community was small but stable, and they maintained the same boundaries they'd established decades earlier. But they were aging. I could see it. The big male, who I estimated had been in his prime when I first saw him in 1983, moved more slowly now. His gait had stiffened, and on cold mornings I'd see him favoring his left hip the way I favored my right knee. The female appeared less frequently, and when she did, she stayed deep in the timber, barely visible. And the pup, my pup, the one whose broken leg I'd splinted with cedar shingles in my barn 40 years ago, was showing its age in ways that tightened my throat every time I noticed a new one. More gray in its muzzle, a slight hitch in its step, a tendency to sit rather than stand during our evening meetings at the fence line. We were getting old together. 2 creatures from 2 different worlds, aging in parallel, watching each other slow down. There's something in that, Something I don't have the words for, but that I feel in my chest every time I think about it. In the fall of 2022, I saw the pup for what I believe was the last time. I was 76 and using a cane by then, and I'd reduced my evening walks to a short circuit along the nearest section of the north fence, maybe a quarter-mile out and back. It was October. The aspens were turning, and the valley was that particular shade of gold that makes you understand why people drive hundreds of miles to see Montana in autumn. I was at my usual spot near the old watering trough when the pup emerged from the timber. It moved slowly, more slowly than I'd ever seen it move, and when it came into the open, I could see why. It was thin. Its fur had dulled to a grayish brown, and its amber eyes, those eyes that had looked up at me from the bottom of a well 39 years ago, had a clouded quality that I recognized because I'd seen it in old dogs and old horses and old people. It was dying. Maybe not that day or that week, but the process had begun the same way it's begun in me now, the slow dimming that nothing can reverse. It came to about 15 yards from me and sat down heavily in the grass, and we looked at each other. Two old creatures at the end of their respective roads, sharing a silence that held 40 years of history. Then it reached into its chest for one final time. It pulled out a cord. Not a new one. The original cord, the one with the carved hand that it had given me in May of 1985. Except now there were two stones on it, the hand and a new carving. This one was a circle, simple, complete, unbroken. It set the cord on the ground and pushed it toward me, and then it made the three-tone greeting, low, mid, rising, but quieter than I'd ever heard it, barely more than a breath. I walked forward and picked up the cord and held both carvings in my palm, the hand that reaches, the circle that completes. I looked up and the pup was watching me with an expression I'd never seen on its face before, and I understood it as clearly as if it had spoken English. This was goodbye. Not the temporary goodbyes we'd exchanged thousands of times at dusk on the fence line. The real one. The final one. I wanted to say something. I wanted to find words big enough and true enough to hold everything those 40 years had meant. But there are no words for that. Not in English, not in whatever language the creatures speak, not in any system of communication that has ever existed. Some things are too large for language. You just have to stand in them and let them be what they are. I raised my hand, the same way I'd reached down into the well in September of 1983. Palm out, fingers spread. The pup raised its hand. Same gesture, same 5 fingers, same reaching. And then it turned and walked back into the timber, and the gold light of the October afternoon closed behind it like a curtain, and I haven't seen it since. I want to be clear about something before I finish. I am not telling this story because I want fame or attention or money. I don't want any of those things. I've had my life, and it was a good one, and the best and strangest part of it happened in the space between my fence line and the forest. I'm telling this story because I'm dying, and because the truth matters, and because somewhere in the Bitterroot Mountains of western Montana, there is a community of beings that are not human and not animal, but something in between. Something that carries grief and makes art and forms bonds across the species barrier and sings when those bonds are broken. And they deserve to be known, not captured, not studied, not hunted or driven away or turned into specimens. Known. The way you know a neighbor, the way you know a friend. The cord with the 2 carvings is around my neck right now, the way it's been around my neck for almost 40 years. The hand that reaches, the circle that closes. When I'm gone, Karen will find it, and she'll find the box of stones in the top drawer of my nightstand, and she'll find this recording, and she'll have to decide what to do with all of it. I hope she decides to believe me. I hope the world does too, but that's not really the point. The point is that I was 37 years old when I lowered myself into a well and carried out something impossible. And that something impossible carried me through the next 40 years of my life. And now at the end, looking back, I wouldn't change a single day of it. Not the fear, not the cattle, not the secrets, not the loneliness of knowing something nobody else knows. Not even losing Margaret, because Margaret knew too and she chose to stay. And she wore that cord until the day she died. And that tells you everything you need to know about what we found in those mountains. Whatever these creatures are, wherever they came from, however long they've been watching us from the edges of the forests we think we own, they are real. They are intelligent. They are capable of things we haven't even begun to imagine. And if you ever find yourself standing at the edge of a well, hearing a sound that doesn't belong to any animal you know, I hope you do what I did. I hope you climb down. If this story meant something to you, I'd appreciate it if you'd subscribe to this channel and share it with someone who might need to hear it. There are more stories like mine out there. More people carrying secrets that are too heavy for one person, and the more of us who speak up, the harder it becomes to pretend these things don't exist. Leave a comment and tell me what you would have done if you'd found that pup in the well. I'd like to know. And wherever you are tonight, whatever wilderness is closest to your door, be safe out there. Pay attention. Respect what you don't understand. And if something reaches out its hand to you from the dark, maybe think twice before you walk away. Some connections are worth everything they cost. I know mine was.